house had stood for over a century, its wooden bones settling into the earth like an ancient beast unwilling to die. James had seen the listing online, a fixer-upper on the outskirts of town, cheap enough to be suspicious, but he hadn't asked too many questions. The ad had described it as full of character, a phrase that masked 1,000 unspoken horrors. When he arrived, the air around the house felt dense, like the atmosphere changed the moment he stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, a sound that was not quite wood, not quite natural. It was almost breathing. James dismissed it. Old houses made noise. He had lived in plenty of apartments where pipes knocked like ghosts in the walls, where floors shrieked beneath his steps. This was no different. He told himself that as he pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the dim interior. The house had been abandoned for years, evident in the thin layer of dust on every surface. Furniture sat frozen in time, an old floral couch sagging under neglect, a rocking chair turned toward the window, as if waiting for someone. A chandelier, its crystals dulled by age, hung precariously from the ceiling. That first night, James lay in bed listening to the house shift around him. The creaks came in patterns, too rhythmic to be random. Something about them made him uneasy, but he forced himself to ignore it. Houses settled, wood expanded and contracted with the temperature. Nothing more. He slept fitfully, waking to the sensation of movement, like the walls themselves were shifting, adjusting. By the third day, he had begun to notice strange things. Shadows stretched where they shouldn't. Corners of rooms seemed to pulse when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air in the house was thick, as if it held a breath waiting to be exhaled. One evening, while brushing dust from a faded painting in the hallway, James placed his hand against the wall. He expected the rough feel of old wallpaper, the cool solidity of wood beneath. Instead, the wall yielded. His fingers pressed in, meeting not resistance, but something soft, something that moved. He snatched his hand back, heart hammering. The wall rose and fell, a slow, deliberate motion, like the steady rhythm of breathing. He took a step back, his mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. The house was alive. James tried to reason with himself, perhaps some trick of his mind, exhaustion, a warped panel behind the wallpaper. But the thought gnawed at him, digging in with sharp teeth. He found himself listening more closely to the house's noises, tracing his fingers along the walls when he thought he could feel that subtle movement just beneath the surface. It got worse at night. The sounds of settling became something else, something more deliberate, a slow creaking that almost formed words, the faint rustling of movement just beyond sight, and always the sensation of being watched, as though the house itself had eyes. Then, on the seventh night, as James lay in bed with his pulse thudding in his ears, the house spoke, a whisper so close it might have been inside his own skull, so soft it was barely more than a breath. "You're inside me now." James lay frozen in his bed, the whisper still coiling through his mind like smoke. The house had spoken. Not a creak, not a gust of wind pushing through old boards, but words, intentional, deliberate. He forced himself to sit up, straining his ears against the oppressive silence that followed. The walls seemed to shift in the darkness, stretching, breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the cold wooden floor. The air felt damp, heavy, like the house had exhaled and was waiting for him to do the same. He reached for his phone, the dim glow of the screen barely cutting through the gloom. No service. It had worked earlier, he was sure of it. Panic whispered through his veins, but he swallowed it down. It was just his imagination. He was exhausted, stressed. That was all. He stood, forcing himself to move, to prove that he wasn't afraid. The floorboards groaned beneath him in a way that sounded almost pained. He stepped toward the hallway, but as his hand brushed the wall for balance, he felt it again. That movement beneath his fingers. A slow, rhythmic rise and fall, like lungs expanding. James yanked his hand back, bile rising in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, the shadows shifting unnaturally, elongating in ways they shouldn't. The walls weren't walls. He stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his skull. The air in the room thickened, pressing against him like an unseen force. His breath came fast and ragged as a faint sound drifted through the house. A wet, slithering noise. Something was moving. James spun toward the bedroom door. It was open. He was certain he had closed it before getting into bed. A trick of the mind. That was all. But as he stepped forward, the floor beneath him shifted. The wood sagged slightly, as if something was stirring just beneath the surface. The house was alive. He bolted. The hallway stretched unnaturally, the dim light from his phone barely illuminating the walls that now seemed to pulse with a sickening motion. His bare feet slapped against the floor as he ran, heart pounding. The whispers rose again, surrounding him, weaving through the air, like 1,000 unseen voices breathing in unison. The staircase loomed ahead, twisting in the darkness. He gripped the banister, its surface slick and warm. Not wood at all. A shudder ran through him as he yanked his hand away. But before he could react, the floor lurched. James pitched forward, tumbling down the stairs, his body colliding with the walls, the banister, the air itself, because the house was shifting around him. He hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He lay sprawled on the cold floor, disoriented, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something rotting. Then, movement. Something coiled along the edges of his vision, a writhing mass just beyond sight. He scrambled to his feet, his limbs trembling. The front door. If he could just get outside, get to his car. But the house had other plans. The walls convulsed. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing something beneath. Not plaster, not wood, but something dark, pulsing, wet. James staggered back as a deep tremor ran through the house, a sound that was neither groan nor creak, but something alive. He turned, his breath coming in ragged gulps. He had to get out, now, but as he reached for the door, the floor beneath him rippled. The house was no longer just a house, and James was no longer just a man standing inside it. He was inside it now. James stumbled back, his breath ragged as the walls pulsed around him. The door was just feet away, but the floor beneath him had begun to shift, softening under his weight. It wasn't wood anymore. It was something else, something alive. He lunged for the handle, fingers wrapping around the cold metal, but as he twisted, the door shuddered. A deep groan reverberated through the house, a sound that came from everywhere at once. The walls trembled, their surface splitting open like flesh, tearing. A wet, glistening membrane pulsed beneath the peeling wallpaper. Veins snaked along the wood, writhing, moving with an unnatural rhythm. The house was breathing faster now. James's stomach lurched as the realization sank in. He wasn't standing inside the house. He was inside something else entirely. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder. The words were no longer just a faint murmur in the dark. They were inside his head. "You're part of me now." His vision blurred as the walls convulsed. The ceiling above contracted like a vast ribcage tightening. The very air seemed to push against him, thick with warmth, damp with something that smelled of blood and decay. James screamed, but the house swallowed the sound. The light from his phone flickered wildly. He turned, trying to find another way out, but the hallway was closing in. The walls pressed inward, narrowing, squeezing. Then he felt it. Something moved beneath his skin. His hands shook as he touched his own arm, feeling the ripple of motion just beneath the surface. Something was inside him. A violent shudder ran through his body as a sharp pain lanced up his spine. His vision wavered, the world tilting. The house was absorbing him. Number. No, he wouldn't let it. James gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. Every step felt like wading through something thick and unseen, the floor gripping his ankles. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as the house trembled around him. With a desperate cry, he reached for the window. His fingers scrabbled at the glass, slick with something warm, something alive. The window blinked. A wet, pulsing eyelid slid shut over the pane. James staggered back in horror. There was no escape. Then, the walls opened. The floor beneath him split apart, and something rose. A mass of writhing flesh, a maw lined with rows of pulsing, breathing pores. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping voices weaving together into something that wasn't speech at all. James felt his body weaken, his limbs growing heavy, his own breath sinking with the rhythm of the house's breathing. The walls tightened, the ceiling contracted. The house was pulling him inward. His fingers sank into the walls as they softened. The last thing he saw was the floor opening beneath him, the darkness stretching wide, pulling him down, down, down. And then, silence. The house exhaled, and James was gone. The walls stilled. The whispers faded. The air settled into a heavy stillness. The house, whatever it had been, grew quiet once more. And then, somewhere deep inside its bones, it began to breathe again. It had been a long and grueling week for Jonathan Haynes. The writer, with a passion for suspense and horror, had spent countless hours hunched over his desk, his fingers dancing on the keyboard. The rhythmic clicking of the keys had become the soundtrack of his life, an accompaniment to his mental journey into worlds filled with terror, twisted minds, and unimaginable horrors. But tonight it was different. Tonight, he was done. The last words had been written. The final chapter concluded. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. He had always prided himself on his ability to write dark and thrilling tales that kept readers on the edge of their seats, their hearts racing as they turned each page. Yet, despite his success, something had changed in him over the past few months. The stories he wrote were no longer just stories. They had begun to haunt him in ways that were harder to ignore with each passing day. The characters he created were growing more real, their motivations and actions eerily reflective of the world around him. But it was a feeling he couldn't quite shake, a sense that his stories were somehow alive, moving beyond the confines of his mind and onto the page. Jonathan rubbed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. He needed rest, a moment of clarity before he sent the manuscript to his editor. But first, he had to review the pages one last time. He closed his laptop with a soft click, stood up, and stretched. His legs were stiff, and the weight of exhaustion was settling into his bones. With slow steps, he walked over to his desk drawer, pulling it open and retrieving the printed manuscript he'd been working on for months. Each page had been carefully proofread, each sentence crafted to perfection. He felt a small surge of pride as he flipped through the thick stack of paper, seeing the culmination of his labor in his hands. But as he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A page seemingly out of place, stuck halfway out of the stack. It was a single sheet, not part of the manuscript he remembered printing earlier. Jonathan frowned, his brow furrowing, as he pulled the paper free from the stack. The page was blank, except for a single line of text. The writing was not in his usual hand, nor was it familiar in any way. Curious and slightly unnerved, Jonathan read the line aloud in his mind, and then he looked up, and it was already too late. A chill crept down his spine as he stared at the words, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. He scanned the rest of the page, but there was nothing else. No explanation, no context, just those words. His fingers trembled as he held the page, unsure of what to make of it. Had he written this himself? It didn't seem possible. He had never penned these words, never created a line like this in any of his drafts. Jonathan's mind flickered with an uneasy thought. What if someone else had written this? Someone who had access to his work, someone who had been watching him. But no one else had been near his desk. No one else had touched his manuscript. The room was empty, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, Jonathan placed the strange page back among the others and made his way back to his desk. He needed to focus. He needed to get the manuscript sent off to his editor. But his mind kept returning to that extra page, to the words that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. He reached for his laptop once again, but his hand faltered, hovering above the keyboard as a strange sensation washed over him. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if something was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Shaking his head, Jonathan dismissed the thought as paranoia. It had been a long week, and his mind was playing tricks on him. He focused on the task at hand, his fingers tapping out the message to his editor. He hit send, the email flying off into the ether. But even as the words left his screen, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He wasn't sure why, but something didn't feel right. Jonathan looked around the room, his gaze scanning the shadows in the corners. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room barely audible. It was almost as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He stood up again, his eyes darting nervously to the corner of the room where the page with the strange text still lay. He walked over and picked it up once more. This time, he examined it closely, his eyes tracing the edges of the paper, searching for any clue that might explain its sudden appearance. But it was like it had always been there, like it had always belonged. Jonathan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he turned the page over. His stomach lurched. On the back of the page, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, were more words. He would turn around soon, and then it would be too late. His pulse quickened. His heart began to race. The room, once familiar and safe, now felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. Jonathan's mind spun in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He didn't understand. He didn't know what was happening. But one thing was clear. He was no longer in control. The words on the paper weren't just words. They were instructions guiding him. controlling him in ways he couldn't comprehend. His gaze flickered nervously around the room, his eyes falling on the clock on the wall. The ticking of the seconds seemed louder, more insistent, as if mocking him. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and glanced once again at the page in his hand. His fingers clutched the paper tightly, as if holding on to it would keep the terror at bay. But it was already too late. A sudden movement caught his eye. It was quick, just a flicker in the corner of the room. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He froze, his body stiff, his mind screaming at him to move, to run, to do something. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by fear, his body betraying him as he stared at the empty corner. And then he looked up. The room was not as it had been just moments before. It felt darker, the shadows deeper, more oppressive. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and Jonathan felt as if something was drawing closer, something he couldn't see but could feel, like a presence moving just out of sight, watching him, waiting for the right moment. His eyes flickered back to the page in his hand. The words on the paper had changed again. This time, they were no longer just cryptic phrases. They were a description, a precise, chilling description of everything he was doing in that moment. Jonathan stood up, his heart racing. He looked around the room, his breath shallow. The darkness seemed to press in on him, suffocating him. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. Jonathan's pulse hammered in his chest as the words seemed to come to life, each one like a dagger driving deeper into his mind. His eyes snapped up, searching the room for any sign of what was happening, what he had been warned about. But all he saw was the same empty room, the same familiar objects, except for one thing. In the far corner, standing just out of the reach of the dim light, a figure stood. He couldn't make out the details, but it was there, watching him. And then, without warning, it moved. The air went cold, and Jonathan's body went numb. His heart pounded louder than ever, and his breath caught in his throat as the figure in the corner began to step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring each moment. He tried to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The fear gripped him tighter, and he knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that it was already too late to escape, too late to fight back, too late for everything. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer until Jonathan could see its face, a face he had never seen before, but one that was strangely familiar. It was as if he had seen it in his dreams, in the pages of his stories, in the shadows of his imagination. But now, it was real, and it was too late. The last thing Jonathan saw was the cold, empty eyes staring back at him. Before everything went black, the manuscript sat on the desk, the last page still open. The words were still there, unchanged. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. It was too late for Jonathan Haynes, the writer who had once controlled the stories. Now, he was nothing more than a character in someone else's tale, and the story would continue as it always had. The room was quiet, too quiet. Jonathan stared at the page in front of him, the eerie words lingering in his mind. It was almost as if they were haunting him, whispering something he couldn't quite grasp. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. The words seemed to echo in the back of his mind, their meaning more sinister than anything he could have imagined. He had to find a way to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank, something his editor had slipped into the manuscript just to mess with him. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Jonathan knew it wasn't true. His editor would never do something like that, not in a million years. So, if it wasn't a joke, if it wasn't some kind of mistake, then what was it? Where had this extra page come from? And why did it feel like it was meant for him? Specifically for him. Jonathan glanced around the room once more. Everything looked normal, just as it had before. The desk, the shelves lined with books, the window letting in the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But despite the mundane setting, something had changed. A heaviness had settled in the air, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't shake. He felt like a character in one of his own stories, trapped, unaware of what was coming, powerless to stop it. His eyes kept returning to the page. There was something so unsettling about it, the way it was written in that unfamiliar hand. The lines were precise, deliberate, as if the person who had written them knew exactly what would happen next. Jonathan's fingers twitched with unease as he flipped the page over once again, as if hoping to find some explanation. But there was nothing. No clue. Just more words that felt like a warning. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. This was ridiculous. It had to be a mistake, some odd coincidence. He would forget about it. He would get back to work. But as soon as he turned his attention back to the manuscript in front of him, the words on the page seemed to blur, to shift, as if the story was changing before his very eyes. His heart skipped a beat as the text morphed, taking on new meaning. His hands trembled as he tried to read the new lines. Jonathan felt the weight of the page in his hand, and the room around him grew colder, darker. His heart raced as he turned, feeling the presence of something behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The words were now describing exactly what he was experiencing in real time, as though the page was alive, feeding off his every action, every thought. Jonathan's mouth went dry as he stared at the lines, his stomach churning with an inexplicable dread. It was like the page was controlling him, writing his every move before he even made it. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the walls closing in, the floor beneath him becoming less solid, less real. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor with an unnerving screech. He had to get out. He needed to breathe. He needed to escape this feeling, this nightmare that was closing in on him. But as soon as his feet hit the ground, the words on the page changed again. Jonathan stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved to the door, but as his hand reached for the knob, he stopped. Something was wrong. The air was too still, too thick with an unseen presence. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His hand froze above the doorknob, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. The story he had written, the very thing he had created, was now writing itself. It was as though the page had become sentient, aware of his every move, anticipating him. He stepped away from the door, panic rising in his chest as he backed into the corner of the room. His mind spun in circles, his heart hammering against his ribcage. He had to think. He had to figure out what was happening. But the more he tried to grasp the situation, the more it slipped away from him. He had no answers, only the growing sense of dread that crept up his spine with every word he read. The lights flickered above him, casting strange, distorted shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, elongating into unnatural shapes. Jonathan turned his head, his eyes searching the room for something, anything, that could explain what was going on, but there was nothing, only the creeping sense of something closing in on him. The page in his hand rustled, the words on it shifting once again. Jonathan could feel the presence now, the thing that had been watching him from the shadows. It was close, too close. He turned around, but there was nothing there. No one, no sound, just the cold, suffocating silence. His pulse quickened as he spun around, his gaze darting to every corner of the room. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if it was pressing down on him. He could feel his breath shallow, his chest tightening with every passing second. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was drowning in the oppressive weight of it all. Then, there was a sound. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, like the rustling of fabric. Jonathan's head snapped toward the noise, his eyes wide with terror. He strained his ears, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint creak of floorboards. Something was moving. His heart raced as the footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, his feet unwilling to take him anywhere. The words on the page in his hand shifted once again, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he read them aloud in his mind. The figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes locked on Jonathan. He could see it now, standing at the edge of the room, its shape barely visible in the dim light. Jonathan turned toward the corner of the room, his eyes straining to make out the figure in the darkness. It was there. He could see it now, its outline barely perceptible, its form flickering in and out of existence. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through him. His mind reeled, his chest tightening as the fear overwhelmed him. He had to get out. He had to escape before it was too late. But the figure began to move, its steps slow, deliberate, each one drawing closer and closer. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to force his legs to move, to make a break for the door. But his body wouldn't respond. It was as though he were trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape the suffocating reality that was closing in on him. The figure was almost upon him now, its presence overwhelming, filling the room with an air of malice that made Jonathan's skin crawl. He could feel it, its gaze, its intent, pressing down on him like a physical weight. And then, the words on the page changed once again. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against his skin. And then, it whispered his name. His stomach lurched as the room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching toward him like claws, reaching for him. The figure's hand was inches from his face, and Jonathan could feel its icy breath on his skin. His body tensed, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move, to escape. But he was trapped, helpless. "Jonathan," the figure whispered again, its voice low and menacing, sending a chill through his spine. "You're too late." The world around him seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the air growing colder and colder. Jonathan's vision blurred, his thoughts becoming muddled as the presence around him grew stronger. He could feel himself slipping, falling, as though he were losing touch with reality itself. And then, the words on the page shifted once more, but this time, Jonathan couldn't read them. The letters twisted and contorted, their shapes becoming jagged and foreign, as though they were no longer words at all, but something else, something alive. He blinked, his head spinning as he looked around. The room was no longer the same. The walls were closing in, and the shadows had taken form, twisting and stretching into shapes that he couldn't comprehend. The figure, the thing that had been watching him, was no longer just a presence. It had become something real, something tangible, something that was now standing right in front of him. Jonathan's mouth opened in a silent scream as the thing reached out for him, its cold, clammy fingers brushing against his skin. And then there was nothing. The words on the page were still there, but Jonathan no longer mattered. The story would continue, with or without him, and the end was coming as it always had. The last thing Jonathan saw was the figure, its eyes burning into him, and the final words on the page. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. It was too late for him, and now it was too late for anyone. The days that followed Jonathan Haynes' disappearance were filled with an eerie, unsettling calm. His publisher, his editor, even his closest friends had searched for him for weeks, but no trace of Jonathan had been found. His phone went unanswered, his email inbox sat untouched, and the manuscript he had been working on for months was left incomplete on his desk. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded within the walls of Jonathan's home. People would soon forget the strange disappearance of the reclusive author, his name fading from the public's mind like a forgotten whisper in the wind. But deep within the dark corners of the publishing world, something stirred. The unfinished manuscript, the last work of Jonathan Haynes, was passed along to his editor, who was eager to bring it to print. She had no idea what had happened to Jonathan, and she hadn't expected to be confronted with a mystery like the one that lay before her. When Jessica Collins, Jonathan's editor, sat down to read the manuscript, she was taken aback. It was unlike anything Jonathan had written before, a disturbing blend of reality and fiction. As the pages turned, Jessica's unease grew. She knew Jonathan's work well enough to recognize his style, but this was different. This was something darker, something that felt real. The text seemed to bleed off the page, each word more alive than the last. There were descriptions of events, things that seemed to happen in real time, things that were so precise, so chilling, that Jessica found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once as she read. The deeper she delved into the manuscript, the more she found herself drawn into its eerie grip. Every sentence felt like it was written for her, like she was living Jonathan's nightmare, sharing his descent into madness. And then came the final lines, the ones that stopped her heart cold. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. Jessica sat back in her chair, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The words were the same ones that had haunted Jonathan in his final moments, the words that had written his fate, that had sealed him into the nightmare he had become a part of. But as she stared at the last line, something strange happened. She felt a sudden, inexplicable compulsion to look up, to glance at the shadows creeping across her office, at the corner of the room where the light barely reached. She shook her head, trying to push the irrational fear away. It was just a story no more real than the pages it was printed on. But the feeling lingered. The manuscript was sent off to the publisher, and soon enough, the book hit the shelves. It was a hit. No surprise there. Jonathan Haynes' reputation as a master of horror had made the release a highly anticipated event. The readers devoured the novel, each one enthralled by the strange tale that seemed to reach into their very souls. Word spread quickly, and soon the book was the talk of the town. Some readers loved it, claiming it was the scariest thing they had ever read. Others found themselves unnerved, unable to shake the sense that something wasn't quite right about the story, like it was somehow more than just fiction. But then, strange things began to happen. People who read the book began to report odd occurrences. Some heard strange noises at night, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Others claimed to have seen the shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms, figures that vanished the moment they turned their heads. There were whispers of a curse, of a malevolent force tied to the book, a presence that had attached itself to Jonathan's final work. But no one could explain it. No one knew where it came from or how it happened. All they knew was that the book felt different. It wasn't long before the first death occurred. A young woman named Sarah was found dead in her apartment, her body contorted in a way that defied explanation. Her eyes were wide open, fixed in a terrified stare, and there was an eerie, unsettling smile on her face. The authorities were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. It was as if she had simply died. The only clue was a single page from the book, found clutched tightly in her hand, the same page that Jonathan had once held in his trembling fingers. The reports of strange deaths began to spread, each victim found in a similar state, eyes wide with terror, a grotesque smile frozen on their faces, and the same page of the manuscript in their hands. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. The book, they said, was cursed. The story had crossed the line between fiction and reality, and now it was claiming lives. Jessica, the editor who had once been so fascinated by Jonathan's work, found herself haunted by the events surrounding the book. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible. After all, she had been the one to publish it, the one to send it out into the world. Was it her fault that this nightmare was spreading? Was there something she could have done to stop it? Desperation drove her to the only place she thought might offer some answers. Jonathan's home, the house where he had vanished without a trace. She knew she couldn't go alone, but she had no choice. The fear that gripped her had become all-consuming, and she couldn't escape it. She had to face it head-on. The night she arrived at Jonathan's house, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The house stood dark and silent, its windows staring out like hollow eyes, watching her every move. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest, and stepped inside. The house felt cold, far colder than it should have been, considering the mildness of the evening outside. She wrapped her arms around herself for warmth, but it did nothing to ease the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The walls were lined with bookshelves, just as they had been when Jonathan was alive, but the books themselves seemed different now, worn, their spines faded, as if they had been there far longer than they should have been. Jessica made her way through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on her like an invisible force. She reached Jonathan's study, the room where he had spent countless hours writing, the room that had once been filled with the sound of his typing. But now, it was empty. The desk sat undisturbed, papers scattered across the surface, as if Jonathan had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. She approached the desk, her hands trembling as she touched the surface. There was something there, something that caught her eye. A single page sitting in the center of the desk, as though it had been waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked it up, the familiar, chilling words staring back at her. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. The words seemed to pulse, to throb with a life of their own. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the weight of the page in her hand. The room around her seemed to warp and distort, the shadows lengthening and twisting into unnatural shapes. The air was suffocating, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath in front of her. And then, just as she read the words aloud in her mind, the house around her seemed to come alive. She heard a faint rustling, like the sound of paper turning, but there was no breeze. The pages of the books on the shelves began to flip open one by one, as though an invisible hand was rifling through them. A low, eerie hum filled the room, growing louder with every passing second. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness pressing down from all sides. Jessica's breath quickened, her chest tightening with the overwhelming fear that was consuming her. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then it grew louder, clearer, a voice she recognized. Jessica. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Jonathan's voice. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Jessica, the voice repeated, this time much closer. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but the room was empty. There was no one but the whisper that seemed to come from within her own mind. The darkness seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. She gasped for air, her chest tightening as the walls around her pressed closer. The figure appeared just as it had in the pages of the manuscript, standing in the far corner of the room, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. "Too late," it whispered, its voice a cold rasp. "Too late for you." The room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching and warping into grotesque shapes as the figure stepped closer. Jessica's vision blurred, her mind spinning as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She was no longer in control. She was no longer a part of the world she knew. The figure reached out toward her, its cold, clammy fingers brushing against her skin. And as it did, the darkness consumed her completely. The last thing she saw was the faint glow of its eyes, the words she had read 1,000 times echoing in her mind. And then he looked up, and it was already too late. It was too late for Jonathan. It was too late for Jessica. Every night, Peter had the same nightmare. It wasn't the sort of dream that would leave him in a cold sweat or wake him with a start, but it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Every night, the dream unfolded the same way, and every night, it always began with the same figure, someone he did not recognize. In the dream, Peter would find himself alone in a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with the scent of something he couldn't place, like dust mixed with old leather. It felt stale, as if the room hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were bare, cracked, and peeling in places. The only source of light came from a flickering bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that made everything look unnervingly unnatural. There was no furniture, no windows, no doors, just a vast emptiness, a strange void that seemed to consume all of his thoughts. But the most disturbing part of the dream was the stranger. Every night Peter would see him standing at the far end of the room, just out of the reach of the light. The figure would remain motionless, always standing perfectly still, but it was impossible to ignore him. His face, partially obscured in shadow, seemed to carry an unsettling calmness, one that felt more dangerous than any anger or rage. He was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in a dark, weathered coat that looked like it had been worn for years. His eyes were the most unsettling feature of all. They gleamed, pale and lifeless, like empty holes that burned with an unnatural intensity. They seemed to pierce through Peter, as though they could see into the deepest corners of his soul. There was never any sound in the dream, no voice, no movement. The stranger never approached or spoke. He simply stood there, watching Peter with an unblinking stare. It was as if he were waiting for something, waiting for Peter to notice him, waiting for Peter to act. But Peter could never bring himself to do anything but stare back, caught in a silent standoff. At first, Peter thought little of it. Nightmares were a normal part of life, weren't they? Everyone had them, even if they weren't always remembered. The first few nights, the dream would fade into the background of his waking life, a vague recollection that was soon forgotten by the time the day began. But as the nights passed, the dream began to take on a more persistent quality. It became harder to shake off, harder to dismiss as just a product of his mind's wanderings during sleep. It became real. Soon, Peter noticed that the figure was not just present in the dream. He was always there, always watching. His presence seemed to linger in the edges of his waking thoughts, like the remnants of a shadow that stretched into his daily life. The unease that Peter felt upon waking in the mornings began to settle deeper within him, seeping into his bones. Something was wrong. The dreams, as consistent as they were, began to feel like a warning. There was an undeniable weight to the atmosphere of the room, a sense that something terrible was on the verge of happening. And always, at the back of his mind, was the thought, why is he there? Who is he? And why is he staring at me like that? Peter became restless. He started avoiding certain places that felt too similar to the dream. He couldn't stand to sit in a dark room for long periods, or walk alone through empty hallways. Even when he was outside, he would glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from his dreams standing just behind him. But no matter how many times he turned, the figure was never there. Yet the dreams continued. Each night, Peter would return to the same room, to the same oppressive darkness, and to the same stranger waiting for him. The dread in his chest grew with each passing night, but still, there was nothing he could do to escape it. The worst part was that it was always the same. There was no end to it, no escape. No matter how many times Peter woke up, the next night brought him back to that room, to that same figure. But one evening, something changed. It was a normal afternoon when Peter stepped outside. The weather was crisp, a slight chill in the air, the kind that hinted at the approaching fall. He had tried to push the dreams out of his mind for most of the day, but it had been harder than usual. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. As Peter walked through the streets, heading home from work, he caught sight of something in the distance that made his heart race. It was a figure, standing near a streetlight at the end of the block. The figure was tall, dressed in a long coat, and as Peter's eyes focused on the silhouette, an icy chill shot down his spine. He knew immediately that it was him, the stranger from his dreams. The figure stood motionless, just like in the dreams. He was staring directly at Peter, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around Peter faded into a blur, and all that remained was that figure, standing perfectly still, watching him. Peter's legs trembled, and he instinctively took a step back. His breath quickened, his heart thumping wildly in his chest. He blinked, but when he opened his eyes again, The figure was still there, unmoving, unwavering. Peter's mind raced. Was he dreaming? Number. He was awake, fully awake. This wasn't a dream. He turned his head away, trying to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, just another person who happened to resemble the figure from his nightmare. But when he looked back, the figure hadn't moved. The same pale eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a wave of cold terror flooding through him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, Peter thought of running, but his legs felt frozen to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes away. It was as if some invisible force was holding him there, pulling him toward that figure. Then, the figure's lips parted. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming. He knew the words that were about to leave those cold, emotionless lips. "I've been waiting for you to wake up," the stranger said, his voice low and detached, like it came from a far-off place, echoing in Peter's mind. Peter's heart skipped a beat. The words reverberated in his skull, and a sense of suffocating dread washed over him. He took an instinctive step back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was trapped, caught in the gaze of the stranger, just as he had been in his dreams. He blinked again, trying to understand, but before he could react, the figure began to fade, like smoke dissipating in the wind. The edges of his form blurred and evaporated, vanishing into the air, leaving only the echo of his voice lingering in Peter's ears. And then, as the last traces of the figure disappeared, Peter realized that the real nightmare had only just begun. Peter had tried to forget the unsettling encounter he'd had on the street, tried to push the image of the figure out of his mind. But it lingered, like a stain on his thoughts that couldn't be washed away. Every night he had the same nightmare, and every day he found himself walking the streets, looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see that same stranger standing somewhere just beyond his sight. But it never happened again, not at first. Days passed, and Peter tried to live his life as best he could, going through the motions. He went to work, met with friends, had meals, and slept. But all the while, a nagging sense of unease followed him. It was as if the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. No matter where he went, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being followed by invisible eyes. At night, the dreams came again. Each one was the same. The room, dark and empty. The figure, watching from the corner. But now, each time Peter woke from those dreams, his heart would race, his chest tight with fear. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "I've been waiting for you to wake up." It was that phrase that gnawed at him, turning over in his mind like a bad memory he couldn't shake. What did it mean? Why had the figure said that? And why had it been in his dream, only to appear in the real world? These questions swirled around him, suffocating him with confusion. Then, one evening, it happened again. Peter was walking home from work, his footsteps echoing in the empty street as the daylight began to fade. The city was quieter now, the usual hustle and bustle of the day, replaced by the soft hum of distant traffic. The air was cool, with the scent of wet concrete hanging in the breeze. As Peter passed by a row of shops, something caught his eye. A figure standing near the corner, just beyond the flickering streetlight. His stomach lurched. The same figure. Peter froze. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His heart skipped a beat, and his mind screamed at him to run, to flee from the nightmare that had now come to life once more. But his legs felt like lead, too heavy to carry him away. The figure didn't move. It stood there, just as it had in his dreams, waiting, watching, Its face, hidden in shadow, seemed to stare right through him. The only thing that marked its presence were the pale eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. Peter could feel them on him, burning into his skin. He tried to force himself to look away, to pretend this was some sick coincidence, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't tear his gaze from the stranger. The longer he stood there, the more real the nightmare felt. The wind seemed to die down, leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. The street, once bustling with life, now felt eerily silent, as though it had been emptied of everything but him and the stranger. And then, just as it had in his nightmare, the figure's lips moved. "I've been waiting for you to wake up," it said, the voice cold and hollow, echoing through Peter's mind. The words hit him like a slap to the face. They were exactly the same as before, as though the figure had been rehearsing them, waiting for the moment when Peter would hear them in the real world. His pulse quickened. The blood rushed to his ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment it felt like the world was spinning, the ground beneath him shifting like quicksand. Peter couldn't breathe. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. But as much as he wanted to deny it, as much as he wanted to run, the truth was inescapable. The figure, the nightmare, was here. Without thinking, Peter turned and started to walk away, his steps quickening into a panicked jog. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with fear. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, if he allowed himself to glance over his shoulder, the figure would still be there, still watching him. But as he made his way down the street, something strange began to happen. The further Peter walked, the more the world around him seemed to blur. The buildings, the street lights, the distant sounds of traffic, they all seemed to distort, fading in and out like a broken dream. The ground beneath his feet wavered as if it were no longer solid, and the city itself began to crumble, like a house of cards collapsing. Peter stumbled, disoriented. He tried to shake the feeling, to make sense of what was happening, but the world around him continued to warp. The colors bled together, the shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air grew thick, suffocating him with an oppressive weight. And then he heard it, a sound, soft at first but growing louder. Footsteps. Peter's heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, but there was nothing behind him, only the fading remnants of the world he had known. The footsteps continued, growing closer, more distinct. The sound of each step was like a hammer striking the ground, vibrating through the air. He wasn't alone anymore. Panicking, Peter tried to move faster, but his legs wouldn't obey. It felt as though the ground had turned to mud, holding him in place, refusing to let him go. The footsteps came closer, and just when Peter thought he could no longer bear the tension, the figure appeared in front of him, standing in the middle of the street. It was exactly as he had seen it in his dreams, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in that dark, tattered coat. The face, partially hidden in shadow, seemed even more menacing now. The eyes, pale and hollow, gleamed in the darkness, watching him with an intensity that sent shivers crawling up his spine. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence weighing heavily on the air, like an unspoken threat hanging between them. Peter opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, the words trapped somewhere deep within him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape him. And then, the figure spoke again. "You've been running for a long time, Peter," it said, its voice a low rasp that sent a tremor through his entire body. but you cannot run from what's inside of you. The words felt like a physical blow. They hit him, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping. What was the figure talking about? What was it trying to tell him? Peter tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as though the very air around him had thickened, becoming viscous, holding him in place. He could no longer even look away from the stranger. The figure's gaze held him captive, trapping him in a world of shadows and silence. "You've seen me before," the figure continued, its voice growing softer, more insistent. "In your dreams, in your waking hours. You've been waiting for me, all along." Peter's mind reeled. What did that mean? How could he have been waiting for this nightmare? How could he have been expecting something he didn't even understand? The figure's lips curved into a smile, slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The smile was unnerving, not because it was menacing, but because it seemed so unnatural, so empty. It was a smile that carried no warmth, no joy, just an unspoken knowledge of something Peter couldn't comprehend. "You've been waiting," the figure repeated, the words reverberating through the air, through Peter's very soul. Peter's heart hammered in his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to shift again, the edges of his vision growing darker, more blurred. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to escape, but it was as if the world itself was collapsing around him. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The figure, the city, the world, they all froze. The noise, the footsteps, the distorted reality. It all vanished, leaving Peter standing alone in a vast, empty void. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, and the shadows loomed larger, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. Peter blinked, and suddenly he was back on the street. The city was normal again, the lights flickering above, the world spinning in its usual rhythm. But something had changed. He wasn't sure what it was, but as he stood there, breathing in the cool night air, he knew deep down that the nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Peter had always considered himself a man of reason. He didn't believe in ghosts, in curses, or in anything beyond the tangible world that he could see, touch, and understand. The world was a place that worked in cause and effect, logic and reasoning. Yet, as he stood in the middle of that eerily quiet street, his heart still hammering in his chest, he could not deny the terror that clung to him like a suffocating fog. He had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but what he had experienced over the past few weeks was beyond anything he could explain. His waking life had blurred with his dreams, and the line between reality and nightmare had become almost impossible to distinguish. The figure, the stranger, had spoken to him, appeared to him, and somehow made it clear that their encounter was not a random occurrence. It had been waiting for him, watching him, perhaps even guiding him toward something Peter wasn't yet prepared to understand. The air around him felt thick, like the calm before a storm. Peter felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides. The street was still, almost unnaturally so. No cars, no sounds of distant voices or footsteps. It was as if time itself had frozen, as if the world had become a hollow shell, empty and waiting for something that had yet to come. Peter took a tentative step forward, his body still stiff with fear. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, a maelstrom of confusion. Why had the figure spoken those words? Why had it been waiting for him? And what did it mean when it said he had been running for so long? With every step, the sensation of being trapped, of being caught in the figure's gaze, seemed to grow. The shadows of the city stretched longer, darker, as though they were alive, curling and twisting like tendrils, reaching out to ensnare him. The world felt wrong, distorted, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. Peter's chest tightened with a feeling of dread that he could not shake. He glanced around, half expecting the figure to reappear, to step from the shadows once more. But there was nothing. The street was empty, still, silent. He tried to steady his breath, forcing himself to think clearly. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a logical reason for everything that had been happening. It couldn't just be a random series of events, a mere coincidence. The figure had been waiting for him. The question was, waiting for what? Peter's footsteps quickened. He had to get out of this place, had to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to the very air. But no matter how fast he walked, no matter how far he tried to run, the feeling of being watched remained. It was as if the world itself was closing in on him, trapping him in a reality that no longer made sense. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to answer his unspoken question, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You're not alone, Peter." The voice was low, distorted, as if coming from deep within the ground itself. It was familiar, but it was also different, darker, more distorted. It didn't belong to the figure he had seen before, but it sent a ripple of recognition through him. The voice felt like it had been inside his head all along, waiting for the right moment to speak. Peter froze. His pulse quickened, and he turned toward the sound of the voice, his eyes scanning the darkened street. The shadows seemed to move around him, shifting and flowing like liquid. "Who are you?" Peter shouted into the silence, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was deafening. The shadows stretched farther, longer, until they enveloped everything around him, until they became the very air he breathed. Peter felt a tightness in his chest, as though something was pressing down on him from all sides. It was suffocating, all-consuming, and he could barely draw in a breath. And then, suddenly, the darkness parted. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. A different figure this time, but one that felt just as familiar as the first. It was tall, just like the stranger, but its features were less distinct, more fragmented. It was as if the figure had been pieced together from the remnants of forgotten memories. It stepped closer, its presence like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, its energy crackling in the air. The figure's eyes gleamed, but this time there was something different about them. They weren't cold and empty. Instead, they were filled with an ancient, knowing wisdom, a wisdom that made Peter feel small, insignificant, like a mere speck in the grand scheme of things. "I've been watching you, Peter," the voice continued, its tone soft, almost pitying. "You've always known that something was wrong. You've always known that the world wasn't as it seemed. And now, you've crossed the line. You've entered the realm where the rules no longer apply." Peter felt a chill run down his spine. His heart raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to run, wanted to escape from whatever this was, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped in this distorted, nightmarish version of the world, caught between the waking world and the one that had been hidden from him all along. "What do you want from me?" Peter managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, a smile playing at the edges of its lips. It was a smile that was both knowing and sad, as if it understood something that Peter could not even begin to comprehend. "You've already given it to us," the figure said, its voice carrying a weight of finality. "You've given us your fear, your doubt, your uncertainty. You've let us in, Peter. And now, you belong to us." The word struck Peter like a blow to the chest. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt the ground beneath him begin to shift once more. He could feel the darkness closing in on him, suffocating him, and for the first time, he realized with terrifying clarity that there was no escape. The world had changed. The rules had changed, and Peter had crossed the threshold, unknowingly allowing himself to be drawn into a world that was never meant for him. Suddenly, everything shifted. The streets disappeared. The city dissolved into a haze of swirling shadows and fading light. Peter felt himself falling through a vast, infinite void. And then, there was light. It was blinding at first, so bright that it burned his eyes and made him squint. He raised his hand to shield his face, but the light was too strong, too overwhelming. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light faded, and Peter was left in a strange, empty place. It wasn't the city. It wasn't the street. It was nothing. Just a vast expanse of nothingness, stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no sky, no ground, no sound. It was as though Peter had been thrown into the center of the universe itself, an empty void that had no beginning and no end, and standing before him, in the heart of this void, was the figure once again. "You've crossed the line, Peter," the figure repeated, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "But there's no turning back." Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him like a physical force. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure extended a hand toward him, its fingers long and slender. But as it reached out, something inside Peter snapped. The terror that had been building inside him erupted, and before he could stop himself, he screamed, "No!" But the scream was swallowed by the void. The figure didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, it simply continued to reach for him, its eyes locked onto his with a cold, unblinking gaze. Peter's mind raced. He had to do something. He had to escape. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then, just as the figure's hand was about to touch him, something changed. The darkness seemed to recoil. The air itself seemed to split open, revealing a sliver of light, a doorway. It shimmered in the distance, barely visible, but it was there. Peter didn't think. He ran. His legs moved as if they had a will of their own, propelling him towards the light with a speed he didn't know he was capable of. Behind him, the figure's voice echoed, distant, but growing louder. "You cannot escape. You cannot hide." But Peter didn't listen. He ran faster, harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The light was getting closer, brighter, and he could feel the heat of it now, like the warmth of the sun after a storm. And then, with one final burst of energy, Peter reached the light. He stepped through. The world exploded in a brilliant burst of color, and suddenly, Peter was no longer in the void. He was standing in the middle of a bustling street, surrounded by people, by life. It was as if nothing had ever happened, as if the darkness had been a dream, a nightmare that had no bearing on the reality around him. But as he looked around, he felt a strange sense of unease. It was too normal, too perfect. And then, as he walked down the street, he caught sight of something in the distance. something that made his blood run cold. The night was quiet, except for the occasional hum of passing cars outside. Lydia sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. The dim glow of the screen cast soft shadows across the room. She wasn't tired yet, though it was late. The apartment was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the slow progression of time. She sighed, stretching her legs before pulling her long, dark hair into a loose bun. She had been feeling restless lately, uneasy, as if something in the air had changed. It was silly, she told herself. Nothing was different. Everything in her life was as it had always been, predictable, quiet, and uneventful. Still, the feeling lingered. In an attempt to shake off the odd sensation, she opened her camera app and switched it to the front-facing mode. Her tired face appeared on the screen, dark eyes slightly sunken from lack of sleep, lips pressed into a faint frown. She tilted her head, considering whether to post a quick update for her friends, but she hesitated. The apartment was dimly lit, the only source of light being her bedside lamp. She leaned back slightly, angling the camera to capture more of the room behind her, a habit she had developed when taking selfies, just to make the background look more interesting. She snapped at the picture. Lowering the phone, she tapped the image to review it. Her face stared back at her, neutral expression and all, but her stomach tightened the moment she saw the background. There was something there. Someone. A figure stood near the doorway, partially hidden in the shadows. The shape was faint but unmistakable. A person. Lydia's breath hitched. She whipped her head around, staring at the darkened entrance to her bedroom. There was no one there. The doorway was empty, just as it should have been. The hall beyond was silent. Her eyes flicked back to the screen. The image hadn't changed. The figure remained, a blurry outline of a person, barely visible, but present nonetheless. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her heart began to pound. Was this a trick of the light? A smudge on the lens? Slowly, she lifted her phone again, switching back to the camera mode. She held her breath and pointed it at the same angle as before, staring into the screen. Nothing. The doorway was empty. Swallowing hard, she quickly returned to the saved image. The figure was still there, lurking just out of focus. Lydia's hands felt clammy. A cold shiver ran down her spine. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the image had glitched. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. She stood abruptly, her body tense. The room around her felt different now. Darker, heavier. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than before. She took a hesitant step toward the doorway, her bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. The hallway beyond stretched into darkness. She was alone, wasn't she? Her phone screen dimmed, and for a split second, as her reflection flickered in the blackness, she thought she saw something move behind her, a sharp intake of breath. She spun around, fast, but there was nothing there, just a room, quiet and still. And yet, as she stood there, gripping her phone tightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that she wasn't alone. Lydia's breath came in shallow bursts as she forced herself to look around the room again. The rational part of her brain screamed that she was being ridiculous. It was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. She had to prove it to herself. She hesitated before opening the photo again, her fingers trembling slightly as she zoomed in on the figure. The shape remained indistinct, blurred, as if it had been captured mid-motion. The more she stared, the harder it was to tell if it was truly a person at all. Her mouth felt dry. It didn't make sense. With sudden determination, she turned on every light in the apartment. Brightness flooded the small space, erasing every trace of shadow. She took a deep breath and lifted her phone again, switching back to the front camera. She positioned herself in the exact same spot, angling the lens toward the doorway. She snapped another picture. Immediately, she opened the new image. Empty, just as she had expected. A wave of relief washed over her, though the tension in her shoulders refused to ease completely. It was a mistake, a smudge on the lens, or maybe even some visual artifact created by the dim lighting. She exhaled shakily and forced a small, nervous laugh. She was overthinking things. Still, she couldn't bring herself to delete the original photo. Something about it unsettled her too deeply, as if erasing it would somehow make things worse. Shaking her head, she placed the phone face down on her nightstand and climbed into bed. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the image from her mind. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She was alone. She repeated it to herself, as if saying it enough times would make it feel true. The exhaustion of the day finally began to weigh on her eyelids growing heavier. She closed them, exhaling slowly, her body sinking into the mattress. Minutes passed. Then something shifted. A faint creak. Lydia's eyes snapped open. She lay frozen, ears straining. Silence. Had she imagined it? Her pulse thudded against her ribs. She turned her head slowly toward the doorway, where the darkness of the hall stretched beyond the reach of her bedroom light. Nothing moved. She was just on edge, that was all. Shaking herself, she rolled onto her side and closed her eyes again. But then, a soft rustling. Not loud, not obvious, but just enough. Her breath hitched in her throat. This time she didn't move. She didn't dare. It had come from inside the room. A whisper of sound, like fabric shifting, like something brushing against the air. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating. Her heart pounded. She forced herself to sit up. The room was exactly as it had been moments ago. Nothing had changed, except for her phone. It was no longer face down. It lay on the nightstand, screen up, the faint glow casting a soft light on the ceiling. A chill prickled at the back of her neck. She was certain, absolutely certain, she had placed it face down. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for it. The screen was still open to the Photos app. Her stomach twisted as she saw what was on the display. It was the same photo, the one she hadn't deleted. But something was different. The figure in the doorway. It had shifted. It was no longer just a blur. It was clearer, closer. Lydia's pulse roared in her ears as she stared at the phone screen. The figure had moved. Not a trick of the light. Not a glitch. It was real. She couldn't breathe. The shape in the doorway was no longer just a smudge of darkness. It had depth now, detail, the faint outline of a head, a torso, limbs, and the worst part, its face. No, not a face. A void where a face should be. She felt the air in the room grow heavier, as if something unseen had filled the space. The walls seemed to press inward, the darkness beyond the doorway deepening, pulsing, alive. She wanted to look away. She needed to. But then, a notification popped up over the image. New photo saved. Her breath caught in her throat. Remember, she hadn't taken another picture. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the screen. The photo app opened again. A new image. Her room. Her bed. Herself. But from a different angle. As if someone, something, had taken it while standing right next to her. She threw the phone away from her, her breath coming in sharp gasps. It landed with a soft thud on the bed, screen up, still glowing. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard. Then, the screen flickered. For the briefest second, the reflection on its surface wasn't hers. Something else stared back. A shape, thin, wrong, too tall, loomed behind her. Its head tilted unnaturally, body shifting as if it was aware she was watching. A hand, long skeletal fingers, began to reach forward. Lydia screamed. The lights in the room flickered violently, the air thick with something unseen, something watching. She turned, frantic, expecting to see it, but the room was empty, yet she knew it was here. She grabbed her phone, fingers fumbling as she tried to unlock it. The screen refused to respond. It was frozen, stuck on the image. The figure was closer now, no longer in the background. It was beside her. Her breath hitched as a sound filled the room, distorted, low, something between a whisper and a rasping breath. Her reflection in the phone moved, but she hadn't. The reflection turned its head, looking at her. Not just the phone's reflection, the mirror across the room. Her reflection there was moving, shifting, stepping forward. But Lydia hadn't moved at all. The breath at the back of her neck wasn't hers. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The last thing she saw, before everything was gone, was the reflection stepping out of the mirror. And then, nothing. The first time he noticed it, he assumed it was just a trick of the light. Nathan stood on the cracked pavement of his driveway, the cold autumn air settling into his skin as he fumbled for his house keys. The lone street lamp behind him buzzed softly, casting a long, narrow shadow ahead of him. But then, he saw it, the second shadow. It was faint at first, barely a whisper of darkness stretching beside the first. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes as if clearing them of some smudge that had tainted his vision. The wind rattled the skeletal branches of the trees, sending a chorus of dry leaves skittering across the road. The moment passed, and he shook his head, stepping forward. The second shadow vanished. Nathan dismissed it, just another oddity in a long, tiring day. Work had drained him. The endless clicking of keys and the dull murmur of his co-workers, blending into an exhausting monotony. He had barely touched his dinner before retreating to the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly. The memory of the second shadow lingered in the back of his mind, but he buried it beneath the weight of exhaustion. The next evening, as he walked home from the convenience store, his arms heavy with bags, he noticed it again. The street lamp at the corner stretched his form across the pavement, but there, off to the side, slightly smaller, slightly warped, was another shadow. His breath hitched. He took a step forward. Both shadows followed. He stepped back. They did the same. Nathan frowned, shifting his weight from foot to foot, watching the second shadow mimic him with eerie precision. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the light from a passing car had momentarily interfered. Maybe another lamp somewhere nearby had flickered and overlapped his own. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area. Nothing but the lonely street and the distant hum of the city. He hurried home, heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't quite match his pace. The moment he crossed the threshold of his apartment, he felt safe again. The strangeness left outside with the creeping night. Days passed, and the shadow became a thought he avoided, an unspoken anomaly tucked into the cracks of his daily routine, until it appeared inside. It happened in the bathroom. The overhead light was sharp, sterile, bouncing off the tiled walls and reflecting his image in the mirror. He leaned over the sink, splashing cold water onto his face, letting the droplets cling to his skin before meeting his own tired gaze. And there, just beyond his feet, two shadows stretched in opposite directions. He stared. The first was normal, matching the angle of the light above. The second was wrong. It was darker, its edges not quite as crisp, as if it didn't fully belong to the world. He swallowed, stepping back. It remained. A chill crawled up his spine as he turned sharply, searching for something, anything, that could explain it. But the light had a single source. There were no tricks, no reflections. He moved his hand slightly, watching as both shadows mimicked him. A drop of water slid from his chin and landed on the counter with a soft blink. Then, for just a fraction of a second, the second shadow twitched. Nathan recoiled, his breath strangled in his throat. It wasn't a trick of movement. His real shadow had responded to his own actions. But the other, it had moved just before he did, like an anticipation, like it knew what he was about to do. He fled the bathroom, leaving the light on, refusing to look back. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the darkness press down on him. Every shift in the shadows cast by the street lamp outside sent his mind spiraling into restless paranoia. His apartment felt wrong, unfamiliar. The air felt too thick, the silence too expectant. The days blurred together. The shadow continued to appear, sometimes in the most mundane moments, standing by the stove, washing dishes, sitting at his desk. Always there, always just slightly off. It was when he tried to ignore it that things got worse. The shadows grew bolder. It no longer waited for him to move first. Sometimes it twitched before he did, predicting his actions. Other times it lagged behind, as if sluggishly catching up. Once, as he sat at his desk, he saw it shift out of the corner of his eye. Just a small movement, like a head tilting, like it was watching him. Nathan stopped going out after dark. He avoided standing directly beneath lights, fearing what he might see. He told himself it was stress, that his mind was playing tricks, that lack of sleep was distorting reality. But deep down, a gnawing dread whispered a truth he couldn't escape. He was not alone, and whatever was with him was getting closer. Nathan tried to convince himself that nothing was wrong. The logical part of his brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Something simple, something mundane. He avoided looking at his shadow. If he didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would stop. Maybe it had been stress all along, and once he stopped feeding into the paranoia, it would go away. But avoidance only seemed to make things worse. He first noticed the change while brushing his teeth. The overhead light in the bathroom cast his shadow onto the tiled floor, sharp and defined. But when he reached for the faucet, he caught the flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. Just a fraction of a second. He froze. His breath hung in his chest, foam from the toothpaste clinging to his lips. He hadn't moved, but his second shadow had. His grip tightened around the sink's edge. He dared to glance down. The second shadow stood slightly apart from the first, detached from his feet by just an inch, as if peeling away. It did not ripple. It did not fade. It was solid. He lunged for the light switch. The bathroom plunged into darkness, and for several agonizing seconds, he stood there, ears straining for any sound, heart hammering against his ribs. When he flicked the light back on, his normal shadow returned. The second one was gone. Nathan backed out of the bathroom, leaving the light on, He didn't turn it off for the rest of the night, but the next morning, the second shadow was waiting for him in the kitchen. The pale morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, stretching his shadow across the tiled floor. He stood by the counter pouring coffee, forcing himself to focus on the mundane. But then, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A slow, creeping realization slithered into his mind like ice. His fingers tightened around the coffee mug. His shadow was still. The second shadow was not. It was subtle, a slow, unnatural ripple, like the surface of black water disturbed by something beneath. It quivered at his feet, just slightly detached, a silent pulse that had nothing to do with his movements. A violent shudder ran through him, and he staggered backward. The second shadow did not retreat with him. It swayed, not as a response to the shifting sunlight, not as a trick of his eyes. It swayed the way a body does when someone breathes. Nathan ran. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he needed to get out. The front door slammed behind him, the cold morning air hitting him like a slap. He barely registered the sting. He kept walking, moving through the streets, past the familiar coffee shop, past the quiet neighborhood houses. He didn't stop until he reached the park. The morning was crisp, the ground damp with dew. A few joggers passed him by, their footfalls soft against the pavement. Birds chirped from the trees. It was normal. Everything was normal. Nathan sat on a bench, gripping his knees, forcing himself to breathe. He didn't want to look, but he had to. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his gaze downward. Two shadows stretched from his feet. The first was long and familiar, cast by the sun filtering through the trees. The second stood directly beside it, and it was moving. It wasn't mirroring him anymore. The realization left him paralyzed. He stared as the second shadow trembled, shifting as if adjusting itself, as if settling into a more comfortable position. Then, it twitched, a small, unnatural jerk. Then another. It wasn't mirroring him. It wasn't responding to his movements. It was acting on its own. Nathan shot to his feet. His stomach lurched, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. His vision swam. The world tilted. And then, just for a moment, the second shadow turned. Not in a way shadows should. Not as a trick of the light. It twisted just slightly. Just enough that it felt intentional. Just enough that it felt like it was looking at him. Nathan stumbled back, gasping, heart pounding so hard, it felt like it might crack his ribs. The second shadow did not follow. It remained rooted to the pavement. He ran. The rest of the day was a blur. He avoided the sunlight, kept his eyes away from reflective surfaces, refused to be anywhere with a single light source. The paranoia clung to him like a second skin. He couldn't escape it. Every time he stepped into a room, his first instinct was to check the floor, the walls, the corners where shadows pooled. It didn't matter where he was. The second shadow was always there, and it no longer waited for him to move first. By the time night fell, exhaustion had settled into his bones, heavy and suffocating. He locked his apartment door, shut every window, turned on every light. The television buzzed in the background, its glow casting distorted shapes against the walls. He refused to sleep, but as the hours dragged on, his body betrayed him. His eyes grew heavy. His mind wavered. At some point, he drifted, and when he opened his eyes, the lights were off. Nathan's breath hitched. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest. The television screen was dark. The room was silent. He didn't remember turning off the lights. A slow, creeping dread settled into his stomach. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Something was there, standing in the darkness. He turned his head, and there, just barely visible against the faint glow from the window, the second shadow, not on the floor, not where it should be. It was standing, a silhouette against the wall, tall, distorted, watching him. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. His muscles locked. His skin crawled with a primal suffocating fear. Then, the shadow twitched, not the way a shadow should move, not the way light flickered. It shifted. It took a step towards him. Nathan couldn't breathe. His pulse thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to move, to do something. But his body refused to obey. The shadow took another step, then another, and then it stopped, right beside him. Nathan clenched his fists. His entire body was trembling. He could hear his own heartbeat, deafening, erratic. The shadow loomed over him, stretching impossibly tall, its edges bleeding into the darkness. And then it bent, leaning toward him, close, too close. Nathan's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His vision blurred, his skin prickled with the sensation of something unseen brushing against him. And then, the shadow whispered, a soundless voice, a breath against his ear. And then, darkness. The world was gone. Nathan woke to nothing, a silence that was not natural, a stillness in the air that felt as though time itself had stopped. His eyes fluttered open, but the room before him was not his own. The walls were dark, swallowed by shadows so thick they seemed to breathe, shifting in ways they should not. His body felt heavier than it ever had before. His skin weighed down, as if the very atmosphere was pulling him into the ground. He sat up with effort, each movement sending a shudder of dread down his spine. His fingers brushed the floor, a cold, unfamiliar surface. His surroundings were an unsettling blur. Dim light flickered from nowhere. But it was wrong. There were no edges, no boundaries, no windows to glimpse the outside world. And then he saw it. The second shadow. It was not where it should have been. It was not just in the corner of the room, attached to his own form. Number. It stood across from him in the center, stretched impossibly tall, its outline dark against the ever-changing gloom. The shadows rippled, bending, twisting as though they were alive, as if they knew they had won. Nathan's heart raced in his chest. Panic set in like a fire burning through his veins. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But the shadow, his shadow, remained fixed in place. It didn't move with him, didn't mimic him as it once had. It didn't follow. It was free. A chill wrapped around him, wrapping itself around his spine and constricting his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. His voice was lost, stolen by the overwhelming presence in the room. The shadow didn't need to speak. It had already made its intentions clear. Nathan scrambled to his feet, his limbs trembling beneath him. His head spun, dizziness clouding his thoughts. The weight of the moment, the realization that he was no longer in control, was more crushing than anything he had ever known. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was an endless stretch of shifting, vibrating darkness. The shadow's outline grew more defined, more solid. Its edges began to pulse, slowly at first, then faster. Nathan could feel it, like a slow, growing hunger, gnawing at the air between them. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. And then, as if it had decided, the shadow took a step forward. Nathan's eyes widened in disbelief. his body locked in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow's steps were heavy, resonating in the air, like the slow march of a predator closing in on its prey. Each movement was deliberate, careful. The space between them closed with impossible speed. Suddenly, the ground beneath Nathan's feet seemed to give way. The sensation was like falling, but without the rush, without the pull of gravity. His legs buckled beneath him, his arms shooting out to try and catch himself on the invisible floor. But there was nothing to grasp. He sank like a stone pulled beneath the surface of dark water. There was no light now, only the shadow, the thick weight of it surrounding him, pressing down on him, engulfing him. He struggled, gasping for breath, but the air had turned to something dense and suffocating, a fog that clung to his lungs. And then, for a split second, Nathan saw it, his reflection, not in a mirror, not in glass, but in the dark void itself. The shadow had pulled him into its realm, and now it was showing him something, a twisted reflection of himself. The man in the shadow was not Nathan, not fully. His face was pale, drawn, with hollow eyes that no longer held any life. His body was thinner, his skin stretched tight over bones. And the worst part, the part that made Nathan's heart skip a beat, was the way his mouth moved. A smile, a terrible mocking grin that didn't belong to him. The shadow was smiling. Nathan screamed, but his voice was lost in the thick, suffocating fog. The darkness swallowed it whole, just as it was swallowing him. He reached for his chest, his throat, his head, but he could feel the shadows pressing against him, crawling beneath his skin. They were inside him, consuming him from the inside out. The reflection in the void twisted again. The man in the shadows stretched his arms wide, as though embracing Nathan. But it was not a gesture of warmth, number. It was a gesture of possession. It was taking him, taking everything he was. The room around him began to spin. He felt the pressure, the suffocating weight growing tighter and tighter, as if the walls were closing in on him. But no matter how much he struggled, no matter how hard he fought against the creeping sensation that his body was no longer his own, there was nothing he could do to escape. The shadow had him now. And then, it was gone. The world snapped back into place. The darkness lifted. The air rushed back into his lungs with a violent gasp. Nathan's eyes snapped open, his body jerking upright, his hands shooting out to catch himself. He was back in his apartment. His hands were trembling. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening. Sweat clung to his skin, and his throat was raw, as though he had been screaming for hours. The room was exactly as he had left it. The walls, the furniture, the television. But something was different. The shadow. It was no longer just a fleeting, unnatural thing. No longer a trick of light. It was there, standing at the edge of the room, just out of reach. A presence that Nathan could feel without even needing to look. The light was dim, the shadows stretching far beyond what was possible in the confines of his apartment. But the second shadow was no longer a mere echo. It was alive. It was free. Nathan stood up, his legs weak beneath him. His mind was reeling. He couldn't process what had just happened. His body felt strange, foreign, like it didn't belong to him anymore. He reached out a hand almost instinctively, but the shadow, it was still there, watching, waiting. Nathan knew then that there was no escape, no running, no hiding. The shadow had followed him. It had always been there, lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. And now, it was with him, not as a reflection of what he was, but as something more. It had taken him. and in its place the man who had once been Nathan was no more. All that remained was the shadow, and it would never leave. The house had always felt a little too quiet for Evelyn. It was a new place, a modest 2-story with weathered brick walls and creaky floors, tucked away on the edge of town. She'd bought it in a rush, tired of the cramped apartment life, and eager for a space to call her own. The small town was supposed to be peaceful, a place for her to recover after the chaos of city life, a sanctuary. But there were things about the house, things she couldn't explain, that unsettled her from the very first night. It was a cool evening when she moved in, the kind of weather that made the air feel crisp and alive. As she unpacked boxes in the dim light of her bedroom, she noticed the ceiling fan above her. It was old, one of those metal fans with thick blades that looked as though they could chop through the air with ease. She turned it on absent-mindedly, just to get some air moving around the room, not really thinking about it. The fan began to whirl lazily, and the sound of it humming was strangely comforting. It reminded her of childhood summers, of the heat that would wrap around her like a blanket, and the coolness of the fan as it fought back against the thick humidity. But as the minutes passed, she began to hear something. At first, she thought it was just the whir of the fan blades, the creak of the old house settling. Yet, slowly, a low murmur seemed to rise above the hum, a faint sound like whispers that just brushed the edge of her hearing. She stopped, standing still in the middle of the room, holding a box of books, trying to focus on what she was hearing. The noise was faint but distinct, like someone softly murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. She glanced at the fan, but it was still spinning slowly. There was nothing unusual about it. Shrugging it off, she continued unpacking, but the whispers grew more persistent, clinging to the air like a dense fog. She found herself listening harder, straining her ears. The sound was so quiet that it almost seemed imagined, but it was there, tugging at the back of her mind. She set the box down and walked closer to the fan, leaning toward it, trying to hear more clearly. The whispers felt like they were swirling around her, just out of reach, like they were coming from the space above, from somewhere deep within the ceiling. She turned the fan off, her skin crawling slightly, wondering if perhaps the old blades were simply causing a strange noise as they moved. The room fell into silence, but the eerie sensation didn't fade. She shook her head, laughing quietly to herself. "You're just tired," she told herself. "It's nothing." The next few days passed uneventfully. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of life in the house. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people gave you polite nods as they passed by. But as she spent more time in the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence, the way the air in the house always seemed a little too still. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. It was late one evening, several days after she had first noticed the whispers, when she was sitting on the couch reading a book by the dim light of a lamp. The sound of the fan was back, though this time it was louder, more insistent. She didn't think much of it at first, just chalked it up to the house's old quirks. But as she sat there, a creeping feeling of unease washed over her. The whispers had returned, this time louder than before. She closed her book and stood up, glancing at the ceiling. The fan was spinning lazily above her, but the whispers were there again, clearer now, more defined. She listened carefully, heart pounding in her chest as the sound seemed to grow louder, until she could almost make out the words. It sounded like her name. Evelyn. The word, soft and drawn out, echoed from above, the voice so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. Her blood ran cold, but she convinced herself it was just the wind passing through the old house. Still, she reached up and flicked the switch, turning off the fan. The room was silent again, the stillness almost suffocating. But as the fan blades stilled and the house fell into a deathly quiet, the whispers didn't stop. Evelyn. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. It was coming from above her, from the ceiling, the very place she had turned the fan off. Her eyes darted upward, the hairs on her neck standing on end. It felt as though the air itself had shifted, as though the house was suddenly alive in a way that made her skin crawl. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing. She had just turned the fan off, hadn't she? The room was now still. The whispers, though, had not stopped. They were soft but persistent, and they were saying her name, calling to her from above. She knew it wasn't the wind this time. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, each beat more frantic than the last. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but her throat felt dry, as though the very air had become thick with something she couldn't understand. A chill swept through the room, and she turned on her heel, heading for the door. But something inside her stopped her. She couldn't just leave, could she? She couldn't just let it go. The whispers, the strange sound, the sensation that something was watching her. She had to know what it was. She had to figure it out. Turning back slowly, Evelyn approached the fan again, the weight of the silence pressing in on her. She looked up, as if expecting something to be there, something to appear out of the darkness above. But there was nothing, just the empty space of the ceiling, the fan's blades frozen in place. She stepped back, feeling a strange pull in the pit of her stomach, like some unseen force was compelling her to look again, to listen again. Evelyn. The whisper rang out louder this time, clearer, more urgent. It was coming from the ceiling, but there was no fan moving, no reason for the noise. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, as though the shadows themselves were waiting to move. She reached for the light switch, flicking it on, but the room remained dim, bathed in the pale glow of the lamp. The air felt dense, heavy, as if the space was filled with something else, something waiting. The whispers grew louder, almost desperate now, but the fan was still off. The room was still. There was no movement. The sound should not have been there, but it was. It was as though the voice was calling to her from the very walls of the house itself, from the spaces in between the walls and the ceiling, from somewhere she couldn't see. Evelyn's mind raced. She had to do something, had to make it stop. She grabbed the switch again, flicking the fan back on. The blades began to turn, but the whispers did not cease. If anything, they grew louder. Evelyn. Her legs felt weak. She staggered backward, bumping into the wall behind her. The room spun, the whispers becoming a cacophony in her ears, each repetition of her name more insistent than the last. She could no longer tell where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere, surrounding her. The walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. She tried to leave again, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the room with the voice that was no longer just a whisper. It was a shout, a scream, a maddening sound that filled the air with something darker, something malevolent. The room began to feel smaller, suffocating. She could barely breathe. The whispers, though still soft, became urgent. The voice, it was growing more and more desperate, calling her name with an intensity that chilled her to the core. And then, just as she thought she might lose her mind, the whispers stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Complete, eerie silence. The fan had stopped. The room had stopped. The house, it seemed, had stopped. Evelyn took a trembling breath, still staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next sound to break the silence. The seconds stretched into eternity. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but the quiet was almost worse now, like the calm before a storm. Then, the whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from behind her. Evelyn felt the air grow thick again, the hairs on her neck rising in warning. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes scanning the room with frantic urgency. The whisper, that same soft, insistent voice, had not stopped. It wasn't coming from the fan anymore. But now, it was somewhere behind her. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out all other sound. She refused to turn around, certain that the moment she did, something, someone, would be standing there. She didn't want to face whatever had followed her from the ceiling, whatever had whispered her name with such strange familiarity. Her eyes flicked around the dim room. Nothing had changed, except for the air, which felt heavier now, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch and flicker unnaturally, as though they were moving of their own accord. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent, yet still unmistakably faint. It echoed softly in her ear, as if someone were standing directly behind her, their breath close enough to send a chill crawling down her spine. "Evelyn," the voice murmured, barely a breath, but it was unmistakable. Her body trembled with fear. The sensation was all too real. Someone, something was right behind her. Finally, unable to hold her ground any longer, Evelyn spun around, her heart in her throat, eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing, only the room, dimly lit by the single lamp in the corner, the same shadows creeping along the walls. The air seemed even more oppressive now, like the entire house was holding its breath. She took a shaky step back, her pulse pounding louder than ever. Her eyes scanned the corners of the room once again. No one. The silence stretched painfully long. Her legs shook, but she didn't dare sit. The weight of something unseen pressed against her chest, and it felt as though she were being watched by eyes that didn't belong in this world. Another whisper broke the silence, cutting through her thoughts like a blade. "Evelyn." The voice was too clear now to ignore. There was no mistaking it. It was right behind her, just inches away. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she slowly turned her head, her body trembling as she faced the door. She could have sworn she'd heard something, a shift in the air, the faintest sound of movement. But when she looked, when she peered into the darkness beyond the doorway, there was nothing there. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee from this house, from the suffocating whispers, from whatever presence lurked within. But her feet felt like lead, unable to move. Her chest felt tight, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to get out, but her body refused to listen. She couldn't explain it, but she was certain that the house was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move, to succumb to its endless pull. It wasn't just the whispering, the faint voice in the air. It was the way everything in the room seemed to shift, to bend around her, as though the house itself were alive, as though it was hungry. "Evelyn." The voice was close, too close. It was as if it were coming from the very walls now, from every corner of the room, filling her ears, drowning out every other thought, every other sound. She clenched her fists at her sides, teeth gritted, trying to hold on to her sanity. But the pressure was overwhelming. Her eyes snapped to the door again. The sound of faint scratching came from the wood, subtle but unmistakable. It was as though someone, was moving just beyond the threshold, scraping along the surface, as though something were trying to get in. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat as she realized that the door had been slightly ajar when she turned to face it. How had she not noticed that before? Her body surged into motion, and before she could stop herself, she was walking toward it, each step feeling like a betrayal. Each step felt like she was walking into something far worse than the unknown. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, then froze. The scratching had stopped. The air felt dead again, stifling, suffocating. Evelyn exhaled sharply, her mind racing. What was happening to her? What was happening to this house? She couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't just noises. They were messages, signals. From what? From who? And why her? Why had the house chosen her? With a shaky breath, she pulled the door open, the hinges groaning under the strain. The hallway beyond was dark, an eerie quiet settling over her. She stepped into the doorway, her eyes straining to see anything in the gloom. The house was still. Everything was still. But Evelyn felt something stirring deep in her gut, something dark and unwelcoming. The whisper came again, sharper now, more insistent. Evelyn. She turned sharply, her body stiffening. The voice was no longer in the room. It was coming from above, but not the fan. No, it was coming from the attic. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes went wide. The attic. The thought struck her like a cold fist. She hadn't even considered the attic yet. She had barely explored the house, hadn't dared to venture up into the dusty, forgotten corners of the upper floor. But now the whispers were calling her there. Without thinking, she found herself walking toward the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. Each creak of the old wood beneath her feet seemed amplified in the dead silence, as though the house was alive with its own pulse. She reached the bottom of the staircase and stood there for a moment, staring up at the darkened opening leading to the attic. The air around her seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping as the darkened passage loomed above her, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry, her limbs shaking. But there was no turning back now. She had to face it. She had to know what was behind the whispers. Whatever it wasn't going to stop until she did. Slowly, her hand grasped the railing, and she began to climb the stairs, each step bringing her closer to the source of the whispers, closer to whatever dark thing waited in the attic. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the stairs beneath her weight. The closer she got to the top, the more she could feel the pressure building, a weight that seemed to press in on her from every side. When she reached the top, she stopped, her heart hammering in her chest. The attic door stood in front of her, slightly ajar, but she couldn't see what lay beyond. The darkness there was thicker, denser than anything she had felt before. It seemed to swallow up the light from below, as if it were waiting, expecting her. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't just a faint murmur. It was a command. Evelyn. She didn't hesitate this time. She pushed the door open with shaking hands, and a rush of cold air greeted her. The attic was exactly as she expected, old, dusty, and filled with forgotten things. Old trunks, boxes, and cobwebs covered every corner. The scent of mildew and age lingered in the air, mixing with something darker, something foul. It smelled like decay, like death itself. As she stepped into the attic, her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and her breath caught in her throat. In the far corner, a figure stood, motionless. It was her, or something that looked like her. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but there was no mistaking the familiar outline. The same dark hair, the same face, but something was wrong. Her reflection, if that's what it was, wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. The eyes were too wide, too vacant, as though the soul had long since left the body. And then, from behind her, the whisper came again. Evelyn. But this time, it was not a voice. It was a scream. Evelyn stumbled back, shock rippling through her as she grappled with the sight in front of her. The figure, her doppelganger, stood eerily still in the corner of the attic, shrouded in darkness. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with an inexplicable tension. It was as if time itself had frozen, leaving her trapped in this horrifying tableau. Her heart raced as she tried to process the impossible. How could this be? She looked just like that figure, but the eyes, those eyes were empty, devoid of life. They bore into her with a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. This was not just a reflection. This was something far more sinister, something ancient. The whisper echoed again, sharper this time, slicing through the oppressive silence. Evelyn. She forced herself to take a step back, her breath hitching in her throat. Instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape the attic and never look back. But something kept her rooted in place, a magnetic pull that seemed to bind her to the figure. It was as though the very essence of the house had wrapped around her, urging her to stay, to confront whatever dark truth lay hidden here. The air grew heavier as she gathered the courage to speak. "What do you want?" Her voice trembled, wavering in the dim light. But the figure did not answer. It merely stood there, watching her with those hollow eyes. Evelyn glanced around the attic, searching for something, anything, that might help her understand. Her gaze fell upon the old trunks scattered about, some half open with the weight of dust resting on them, while others were tightly sealed. She stepped cautiously toward one, its latch rusted and worn, and knelt to inspect it. Inside lay faded photographs, yellowed with age, and she pulled one out, holding it to the light. The image captured a family, their smiles wide and bright. But as she examined it further, she felt an icy grip on her heart. The woman in the photograph looked exactly like her. The same dark hair, the same smile. But there was something else, an unsettling familiarity, as though she were looking into a mirror from a past she didn't know existed. She dropped the photo back into the trunk, her mind racing. These were memories of a life that seemed impossibly intertwined with her own. This house, this attic, it wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a vessel of memories trapped within its walls. But why was she here? What was her connection to it all? "Evelyn," the figure whispered again, its voice now filled with longing, a haunting echo that reverberated through her very being. Suddenly, realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a reflection of her. It was a part of her, a shadow she had carried unknowingly, a piece of her soul left behind in this place. The whispers weren't merely calls for help. They were pleas for recognition, for acknowledgement of a past she had tried to bury. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself as she stepped closer to the figure. The weight of fear pressed against her, but she pushed through it, driven by a strange sense of compassion. "I see you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I see you, and I remember. The figure's eyes flickered, the emptiness beginning to fade, as if her words had sparked a flicker of light within the darkness. It took a hesitant step forward, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a glimmer of hope where despair had reigned. You don't have to be alone anymore, she continued, her heart swelling with determination. We're connected, you and I. We belong together. As she reached out, their fingers brushed and an electric current coursed through her. The attic trembled around them, the shadows shifting and swirling like a storm. For a moment, it felt as if the very fabric of reality was bending to their will. The figure drew closer, its features softening, and in that instant, the air filled with warmth. The oppressive darkness began to recede, replaced by a gentle light that radiated from their joined hands. Memories flooded Evelyn's mind. Laughter, love, moments of joy intertwined with pain. She could see glimpses of a life once lived, a life that had been torn away and left behind. The whispers intensified, but they transformed into a harmonious chorus, a symphony of voices singing her name in unity. The house itself seemed to respond, the very walls resonating with an energy that was both familiar and foreign. Evelyn, the voices echoed, no longer haunting, but uplifting, enveloping her in a sense of belonging. As she held the figure's hand, Evelyn felt her own spirit intertwining with the shadow, merging in a way that transcended the physical. The fear that had gripped her heart melted away, replaced by a profound understanding. She was not just confronting a ghost of her past, she was reclaiming it. This was a part of her that needed healing, that needed love. The attic began to shift, the shadows dissolving into light, and she felt the warmth enveloping them both, wrapping them in a cocoon of acceptance. The darkness that had once threatened to consume her now flickered and danced, revealing hidden corners of the attic that had been shrouded in despair. Evelyn's heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of peace. Together they stepped forward into the light, and as they did, the attic transformed around them. Dust motes sparkled like stars, illuminating the space with a golden glow. The old trunks and forgotten boxes faded away, replaced by vibrant memories that floated through the air like wisps of cloud. Laughter echoed, bright and joyous, weaving through the beams of light that filled the room. As they moved deeper into the light, the figure began to dissolve, becoming part of the warmth that surrounded them. Evelyn could feel the love radiating from this place, a love that had been lost and longed for, a love that had echoed through time. The whispers, now a melody, enveloped her, singing of acceptance, healing, and belonging. Finally, with one last glance at the fading figure, Evelyn felt the last remnants of fear slip away. The presence that had once haunted her was no longer a shadow but a memory, a cherished part of her story. She smiled, the warmth spreading through her. As she surrendered to the light, the attic shimmered, and as the brilliance enveloped her, Evelyn felt herself being lifted, suspended in a moment of pure clarity. She was not just Evelyn anymore. She was every part of herself, the laughter, the pain, the love. And in that moment, she understood that the house, with all its darkness and whispers, was a sacred place of connection, a tapestry woven from the threads of her past. When the light faded, she found herself standing in the center of her bedroom, the sun streaming through the window, casting soft rays across the floor. The air was fresh, invigorating, and the oppressive weight that had once filled her heart had vanished. The house was no longer silent. It hummed with life, vibrant and welcoming. Evelyn walked to the window, pulling back the curtains and breathing deeply. The neighborhood outside was alive with the sounds of birds chirping, children playing, and the laughter of neighbors chatting in the streets. The world felt bright and full of possibility, and she knew that she had faced her fears and emerged stronger. As she stood there, soaking in the light, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The whispers were gone, but she could still feel their echoes in her heart. They were reminders of the journey she had undertaken, a journey of self-discovery, of acceptance, and of healing. With a newfound sense of purpose, she resolved to embrace the life that lay ahead. She would honor the memories that had shaped her, and she would carry them with her, not as burdens, but as gifts. The house, once a source of fear, had become a sanctuary of hope, a place where the past and present intertwined, a place where she could be free. Evelyn stepped away from the window, a smile playing on her lips. She would turn the attic into a space of creativity, a haven for her thoughts and dreams. She envisioned it filled with light, art, and laughter, where she could celebrate life and all its possibilities. And so, with each step she took, she let go of the darkness that had once held her captive. The whispers of the past became a symphony of strength that carried her forward, guiding her into a future filled with light and love. Evelyn was home,